Howdy folks, I just wanted to give you a quick video on the Force. I'm going to be taking it up much more deeply, much more detailed as we get out of the prequel trilogy itself, but I did want to take a pit stop and have some words beyond the slides in that continuing Google slide presentation type thing where I'm compiling all of the pertinent Force information because for me at least, Star Wars is the Force. It is lightsabers. That's what keeps this from just being a sci-fi film. As good as it is as sci-fi, it is not just sci-fi, right? Sci-fi never really gets to have magic. Okay, so Star Wars is this firm fantasy thing in a sci-fi setting. I'd even hesitate to call it sci-fi fantasy because I think it might just be fantasy in a science fiction set, right? That's the idea. Imagine if Lord of the Rings goes to space. What would you get? That's where I'm seeing this because it really is the Force that drives this as much as you do get the used universe and all of these things. In those slides about the Force, though, the reason I'm prioritizing this, why it's getting double treatment here is because we have an unprecedented vision of the Force, the living Force. It's been given a name, a term, a concept, and there's a little bit of internal continuity I want you folks to be thinking about as you grapple with this. I've given you Ep4, Ep5, Ep1, and now I want you to think about what happens with Qui-Gon passing this stuff on further. Notice that no one on the council is calling it the living Force. Notice that Obi-Wan later doesn't call it the living Force. All right. I want you to also note just how inextricable nature is from any concept of the Force. We've talked about Yoda in the swamp, Obi-Wan in the desert, and now we have the living Force, this idea of the present, the interconnectedness of all things, the things that surround us and bind us. You will notice that Yoda and Obi-Wan both mention that it is linked to life. Specifically, it is life that creates it. And now we have a much more biological perspective on this. Midichlorians take a lot of heat in Star Wars culture, and yeah, they drive that kind of cringe factor that people have. They're like, let's just not even talk about it. Some people are to the point where it's like, no, midichlorians didn't happen. And this is one of the problems of talking about Star Wars with some people is that, well, they did, right? Qui-Gon Jinn, one of the coolest characters, did talk about midichlorians. It is a fact. We have a count of things. We have a place in which the Force does congregate, does represent. And it's a biological space. It's an ecological space. It is a cellular relationship. We get notions of symbionts, symbiotic relationships. We get notions of animalia happening on Tatooine, on Dagobah. And so I really want you to start thinking about notions of the living Force, the Force, and how these things are being melded, especially as we hit a far more specific video that I'll have for you, probably around Ep3 when we get to that. Then we'll have enough of the pieces to really set this framework up, and it'll help us explain some stuff in Return of the Jedi. And then from there, we have the inheriting sequel trilogy, which is one of those things because I generated these ideas and I published an article on them before episode 8 even came out. So these ideas have a lot of stress attached to them and a lot of relief because there was a point where my article comes out and I didn't know if some one-liner in Ep 8 was going to undo this entire thing, but also I knew that there was no way we could have this many movies. We could have 7 movies and Rogue One, and somehow the claims you make about the Force based on those wouldn't appear later. But this is really going to help us position and situate the Force as we see it unfold in episodes 2 and 3, as we see how this becomes not just Luke's story, it becomes Vader's story, it becomes the Skywalker saga. And so I wanted to touch on a few things there. The living force seems to be more about the connections you have in the moment, in the present. The living force, obviously, there's a biological life component to it, and it often apparently distances itself from the future. It gives a sense of priority to the moment, the now, the present over that future space, which is the most dramatic notion of the Force, the ability to prophecy, to see the future, to see a few seconds ahead so you can block laser blasts with a lightsaber, right? This type of stuff. So this is why I wanted to touch on the Force. I want to draw your attention to it, give a little bit more context. And by the end of this class, we will have finished the idea, the argument, the concept that the living Force is a proper view of the Force. Right, gang? So I just wanted to give a little bit of context supplementing the slides there. There is an excerpt from my article talking about Ep 1, and you'll get a little bit of Yoda and Obi-Wan in it to give you a framework for what's happening with the living Force. So check that out. Check out the slides, and I'll see you in the rest of the vids and on the boards.